The murmurs in the room faded like a dying breeze, replaced by an eerie stillness that pressed against everyone's chest. Maryanne Trump Barry stood at the podium, her presence commanding yet fragile. She gripped the edges of the wooden surface so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her fingers trembled around a single sheet of paper, its edges crinkling under her strain. Somewhere in the distance, a chair creaked as someone shifted uncomfortably. A pen dropped to the floor with a faint clatter, but no one bent to pick it up. All eyes were fixed on her, on the weight she carried and the words she hadn't yet spoken. Maryanne could feel their stares boring into her, each gaze heavy with anticipation. She swallowed hard, her throat dry despite the glass of water beside her. "What am I doing?" she thought, her mind racing. "This isn't just about me. It's about all of us." For years this secret had been buried deep within her, festering like an unhealed wound. But now, standing here, she knew there was no turning back. The silence grew heavier, almost suffocating, as if the room itself held its breath. I don't know where to begin," Maryanne started, her voice wavering. She paused, pressing her lips together as though trying to steady herself. "What I'm about to reveal—" Her voice cracked, breaking off mid-sentence. She closed her eyes briefly, inhaling sharply before continuing. "What I'm about to reveal will change how you see my brother, and maybe yourselves." Her words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding, cutting through the tension like a knife. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by nervous fidgeting. Someone coughed awkwardly, the sound echoing unnaturally loud in the stillness. Wide eyes darted between Maryanne and the mysterious piece of paper in her hand. Inside, Maryanne's thoughts churned. How can I explain something I've spent decades hiding? How do I make them understand why I stayed silent for so long? Memories flickered in her mind, her mother's pleading letters, her father's stern warnings, the fractured relationships that never healed. Each memory felt like a stone tied to her ankles, pulling her deeper into guilt and regret. She glanced at the audience, searching for some sign of compassion, but found only shock and disbelief. One reporter leaned forward, pen poised above his notebook, while another whispered urgently to her neighbor. Maryanne wondered what they were thinking. Were they judging her already? Did they even care about the truth? Or would they twist it into something else entirely? Could one family secret unravel decades of power, pride, and public perception? The question lingered unspoken, hovering over the room like a storm cloud ready to burst. It wasn't just about Donald or the Trump name. It was about legacy, identity, and the cost of silence. Maryanne felt the weight of it all pressing down on her shoulders. Secrets had a way of shaping lives, bending them until they snapped under the strain. And this one had shaped hers more than anything else. Her gaze drifted toward the front row, landing on Ethan, the young boy sitting quietly beside his mother. His piercing blue eyes locked onto hers, filled with curiosity and innocence. In that moment, Maryanne realized he represented everything at stake. The future, untainted by the past, yet bound to inherit its consequences. As the seconds stretched into eternity, Maryanne knew she couldn't delay any longer. The truth demanded to be told, no matter how painful or destructive it might be. With a deep breath, she opened her mouth to speak, her heart pounding like a drumbeat signaling the start of battle. The room buzzed with restless energy, a cacophony of murmurs and shuffling papers. Reporters jostled for better positions, their elbows bumping against one another as they angled cameras toward the stage. The faint click of pens echoed through the chaos, each sound punctuating the growing anticipation. Maryanne could hear it all, the nervous rustle of notepads, the impatient tapping of feet, the occasional cough that seemed louder than it should have been. She stood frozen behind the curtain, listening to the crowd lean forward in unison, their collective curiosity palpable. Somewhere near the front row, a child whispered something to his mother, his voice soft but clear in the otherwise chaotic din. Maryanne's chest tightened at the sound. How many lives will this affect, she wondered, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. Her mind raced back to earlier that morning when she had rehearsed these words alone in her study. Back then they'd felt manageable, distant even. But now, faced with the reality of hundreds of eyes waiting to judge her every move, the weight of what she was about to do threatened to overwhelm her. She took a shaky breath, forcing herself to focus. As Maryanne stepped onto the stage, the faint squeak of the microphone being adjusted cut through the air like a knife. It was an innocuous sound, barely noticeable, yet it sent a ripple of unease through the room. Every ear perked up, every movement stilled. The sharp click of her heels followed, each step reverberating through the space, echoing louder than it should have in the tense silence. Her pulse quickened as she approached the podium. Sweat beaded on her forehead, trickling down imperceptibly under the glare of the spotlight. She could feel its heat pressing against her skin, amplifying her anxiety. Her fingers brushed against the edge of the wooden surface, seeking some semblance of stability. In the audience, someone shifted uncomfortably, the creak of their chair slicing through the stillness. A reporter adjusted his camera lens with a metallic clink, drawing a few irritated glances from those around him. Each tiny sound felt magnified, building the tension until it became almost unbearable. Maryanne gripped the edges of the podium tighter, her knuckles whitening. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, drowning out the faint hum of whispers behind her. This isn't just any speech, she reminded herself. This is everything. What made this moment different wasn't the crowd or the cameras. It was the enormity of what she was about to reveal. This wasn't a routine press conference. It wasn't politics or policy. It was personal, raw, dangerous. Maryanne glanced at the paper in her hand, the words blurring before her eyes. She thought of her brother, of how this would change not only how people saw him but also how they saw her. Would they understand? Or would they condemn her for staying silent for so long? Her gaze drifted across the sea of faces. Some looked eager, hungry for scandal. Others wore expressions of skepticism, doubt etched into their furrowed brows. And then there was Ethan, the boy in the front row. His piercing blue eyes stared up at her, wide and unblinking. He didn't know what was coming, but he sensed its gravity. Maryanne swallowed hard, her throat dry. She knew this revelation would ripple outward, altering perceptions and fracturing relationships. It wasn't just her family's legacy at stake. It was trust, identity, and truth itself. She leaned closer to the microphone, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted to stand here today," she began, her words trembling. "But I can't stay silent anymore." Maryanne Trump Barry had always been a figure of authority, her name synonymous with intellect and poise. As a retired federal judge, she carried herself with an air of unshakable confidence, the kind that commanded respect without effort. But today something was different. Her usual composure seemed fractured, replaced by a fragility that made her almost unrecognizable. Her hands trembled as they gripped the edges of the podium, her knuckles white from the strain. She could feel sweat forming on her brow, trickling down imperceptibly, but enough to remind her of the weight pressing down on her shoulders. Her eyes darted nervously between the audience and the exit behind her, searching for an escape that didn't exist. Inside, Maryanne wrestled with conflicting emotions. How did I let it come to this? She thought, her mind racing. She had spent years building a reputation as someone who could handle anything. Legal battles, public scrutiny, even family drama. Yet here she stood, undone by the truth she'd buried for so long. She glanced at the paper in her hand, the words blurring before her eyes. Each line felt like a betrayal, not just of her brother, but of herself. I should have said something sooner, she thought, guilt gnawing at her insides. But fear had kept her silent, fear of what revealing the truth might cost her. In the front row, Ethan sat quietly beside his mother, his small frame dwarfed by the chaos around him. His piercing blue eyes scanned the room with quiet curiosity, lingering longest on Maryanne. There was something about him, a resemblance, perhaps, to a younger version of Donald Trump, that made her stomach twist. Ethan clutched his mother's hand tightly, his fingers trembling slightly. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he could sense the tension in the air. It pressed against him like an invisible force, making it hard to breathe. His gaze locked onto Maryanne, studying her every move. He noticed the way her hands shook, the beads of sweat forming on her forehead. Something about her vulnerability drew him in, stirring questions he couldn't yet articulate. Who was she really? And why did she look so afraid? Maryanne caught his stare briefly, her breath hitching. Those blue eyes. They reminded her too much of her own childhood, of days spent playing on the sprawling estate with her siblings. Days filled with laughter, yes, but also secrets. Secrets that had shaped them all in ways no one dared to admit. The connection, or lack thereof, between Maryanne and Ethan crackled with unspoken tension. Every time their eyes met, Maryanne felt a pang of guilt, regret, and something deeper she couldn't quite name. Was it fear, regret, or simply the weight of knowing she owed him answers she wasn't ready to give? She glanced at him again, her gaze flickering away almost immediately. Each fleeting moment unsettled her further, amplifying her vulnerability. Ethan's quiet curiosity seemed to pierce through her carefully constructed facade, exposing cracks she'd worked so hard to hide. For Ethan, the tension was less conscious, but no less palpable. He leaned forward slightly, his head tilted inquisitively. "Why is she so scared?" he whispered to his mother, though softly enough that only those closest could hear. Maryanne flinched at the sound of his voice, her heart pounding harder. She wanted to tell him, to explain everything, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she focused on the podium, gripping it tighter as if it might anchor her to reality. Their dynamic remained ambiguous, unresolved, yet charged with emotional complexity. The audience sensed it too, the undercurrent of something unsaid rippling through the room. What was the connection between this boy and the woman at the podium, and why did it feel so pivotal to the story unfolding before them? Maryanne's voice faltered mid-sentence, the words trailing off into an unsettling silence. She had been reading aloud from the document in her trembling hands, but now she stopped abruptly, as if the weight of what she'd just said had physically struck her. The room froze, caught between confusion and anticipation. For a moment, all that could be heard was the faint rustle of paper shifting nervously in the audience and the distant hum of whispers rippling through the crowd. People leaned forward slightly, their breaths held, waiting for her to continue. But Maryanne didn't speak. Her lips parted, then closed again, as though searching for words that wouldn't come. Inside, her mind raced. Did I say too much, or not enough? She felt exposed, raw, like every secret she'd ever kept was laid bare before them. The silence stretched longer than it should have, heavy with unspoken implications. Somewhere near the front row, a child shifted uncomfortably, his small movement breaking the stillness momentarily. From the front row, Ethan hesitated, his hand rising slowly into the air. His small frame seemed almost swallowed by the enormity of the moment, yet his piercing blue eyes locked onto Maryanne with unwavering curiosity. He cleared his throat softly, drawing everyone's attention. "Why?" he began, his voice timid but clear in the otherwise silent room. "Why didn't anyone stop it from happening?" The question hung there, sharp and unyielding, cutting through the tension like a blade. Gasps rippled through the audience, soft and involuntary, followed by uneasy glances exchanged between strangers. Some pressed their lips together tightly, while others shifted in their seats, visibly uncomfortable. Maryanne's heart sank at the sound of Ethan's voice. Those simple words carried more weight than any accusation or demand ever could. They weren't just directed at her, they were aimed at everyone in the room, at the collective failure to act when it mattered most. Her gaze met his briefly, and she saw something in those wide eyes. Innocence, yes, but also a quiet determination. It unsettled her further, amplifying the guilt already gnawing at her insides. Maryanne closed her eyes briefly, trying to steady herself. Her jaw tightened, and she took a shaky breath, fighting back tears that threatened to spill over. Her fingers gripped the podium even tighter, knuckles white from the strain. She wanted to answer him, to explain everything, but the words stuck in her throat. How could she put into language the years of fear, loyalty, and regret that had kept her silent? How could she justify staying complicit in something that now felt so wrong? Every flicker of emotion crossed her face uncontrollably. Pain, shame, resolve. She felt the cameras trained on her, capturing every tremor, every tear welling up in her eyes. The scrutiny only made it harder to find her footing. The audience held its collective breath, waiting anxiously for her response. Some leaned forward slightly, their pens poised above notebooks, while others simply stared, transfixed by the drama unfolding before them. Finally, Maryanne opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, she lowered her head, closing her eyes once more as if bracing herself for what was to come next. Maryanne's voice softened as she began to recount a memory from her childhood, one that had lingered in her mind for decades. "We grew up in a world that seemed perfect," she said, her tone tinged with nostalgia. "Sprawling lawns, grand interiors. It was like something out of a dream." She paused, her thoughts drifting back to those carefree days when laughter echoed through empty halls and sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting golden patterns on polished floors. But beneath the surface there were cracks, small at first but growing wider with time. There was always competition among us, Maryanne continued, her words slower now, heavier. It wasn't just about who could run faster or climb higher. It was about who mattered more, to our parents, to each other. She hesitated, her throat tightening. I remember one summer, Donald and I were playing chess on the patio. He won, as he usually did, but this time her voice trailed off, leaving the rest unsaid. The audience leaned forward slightly, sensing the undercurrent of tension. Maryanne didn't need to spell it out. The implication hung in the air. Even then, favoritism and rivalry had shaped their lives, planting seeds of resentment that would grow into something far more destructive. Maryanne took a shaky breath before continuing. There was an incident, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Something small, at least on the surface, but it changed everything. She described how their father had called them all into his study one evening. The room had been dimly lit, the air thick with unspoken expectations. He handed Donald a key, Maryanne recalled, her words trembling. A key to a safe filled with documents. Important ones. Not me, not Robert, just Donald. Her voice hardened slightly, betraying the bitterness she'd carried for so long. At first, I told myself it didn't matter, it was just a key. But later, I realized what it meant. It wasn't just about trust, it was about power. And once you give someone power, you can't take it back without consequences. As she spoke, Maryanne revealed fragments of the scandal. A web of favoritism, manipulation, and broken trust that had fractured their family. Each revelation felt like peeling back layers of a wound, exposing raw pain beneath. I tried to ignore it, she admitted, her voice breaking, to pretend it wasn't happening. But deep down I knew we were losing something we could never get back. Maryanne stopped abruptly, wiping tears from her cheeks with trembling fingers. Her hands hovered over the podium, seeking stability as her emotions threatened to overwhelm her. I stayed silent, she confessed, her voice cracking under the weight of guilt. Not because I agreed with what was happening, but because I was afraid. Afraid of what they'd think of me. Afraid of being left behind. She paused again, composing herself before continuing. And maybe because part of me thought it didn't matter, that if I looked away it wouldn't be real. Each admission came haltingly, punctuated by moments of silence as Maryanne struggled to find the right words. Her vulnerability was undeniable, her pain palpable. The audience sat transfixed, holding their collective breath as she laid bare not just her family's secrets but her own complicity in keeping them hidden. Finally, Maryanne reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Before she passed, my mother wrote letters to each of us, she explained, her voice softening. In mine, she begged me to do better, to mend what had been broken. She unfolded the letter carefully, her fingers tracing the faded ink. Love isn't measured by success, she wrote. It's measured by the moments you choose kindness over pride. Maryanne's voice wavered as she reflected on those words. For years I lost touch with my faith, she admitted. With who I was supposed to be. These letters, they've haunted me ever since. She looked up, her gaze steadied despite the tears streaming down her face. Legacy isn't about protecting your name, it's about protecting each other. And sometimes, the hardest truths are the ones that set us free. Ethan sat frozen, his small frame trembling as Maryanne's words sank in. Tears streamed down his face, unchecked and unashamed. He didn't try to hide them. Instead, he let them fall freely, each one a testament to the weight of what he was hearing. I wish I could have met her, he whispered, his voice barely audible but carrying an emotional punch that reverberated through the room. The simplicity of his words struck a chord, not just with Maryanne but with everyone listening. His longing for a connection to the grandmother whose legacy had been buried under secrets felt achingly human. For Maryanne, those words were like a knife twisting in her chest. She saw herself in him, her own childhood yearning for approval, for love, for truth. And now here was Ethan, embodying all the innocence and vulnerability she'd once known but lost along the way. His reaction rippled outward, touching the audience in ways no speech ever could. Strangers exchanged glances, their eyes glistening with unshed tears. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others leaned forward, drawn into the raw emotion unfolding before them. Something inside Maryanne snapped. She couldn't stand behind the podium any longer. It felt like a barrier between her and the truth she'd finally spoken. With slow, deliberate steps, she stepped away from it, leaving behind the last remnants of her composed public persona. Her knees buckled slightly as she knelt beside Ethan, closing the physical distance between them. For so long, she'd kept people at arm's length, her family, her emotions, even herself. But now, faced with this boy who carried her brother's eyes and her mother's hope, she couldn't hold back anymore. Without hesitation, she pulled him into a tight embrace. Her arms wrapped around him like a lifeline, and for the first time, she allowed herself to sob openly. The sound was guttural, raw, a release of decades of guilt, regret, and pain. "I'm sorry," she choked out between sobs. "I'm so sorry." It wasn't clear if she was apologizing to Ethan, to her late mother, or to herself. Maybe it was all three. Her breakdown was jarring yet cathartic, a stark contrast to the poised woman who had taken the stage earlier. In that moment, she wasn't Maryanne Trump Barry, retired federal judge. She was simply a woman grappling with the weight of her choices and the fractured bonds of her family. The room fell silent, except for the muffled sounds of crying. Reporters who moments ago had been furiously scribbling notes or adjusting camera lenses lowered their equipment. Some stared blankly at their notebooks, pens hovering uselessly above empty pages. Others wiped their eyes discreetly, unwilling to admit how deeply they'd been moved. In the front row, a woman clutched her husband's hand tightly, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Nearby, a man exchanged a stunned glance with his neighbor, both wordless but united in their shared awe. Even those who prided themselves on professionalism found it impossible to maintain composure. One journalist muttered softly to herself, "This isn't just about them. It's about all of us." As the initial wave of emotion settled, the silence lingered, a collective breath held by everyone present. It wasn't uncomfortable, rather, it felt sacred, as though the room itself had become a vessel for healing. And then, faintly, came the sound of sniffles and soft whispers, breaking the stillness. The emotional release was palpable, washing over the crowd like a tide. No one spoke loudly, but the shared understanding that some truths are too heavy to bear alone hung in the air, binding them together in a rare moment of unity. Maryanne's voice steadied as she spoke, each word carrying the weight of everything she'd just shared. "We spend so much time protecting our legacies," she began, her tone firm but tender, "that we forget to protect each other." She paused, letting the truth of her words settle over the room. Her gaze swept across the audience, lingering briefly on Ethan before continuing. "Love isn't measured by wealth or success. It's measured by the moments we choose kindness over pride." Her delivery was deliberate, filled with conviction despite the raw vulnerability she'd shown only moments ago. It was as if she had reached a place of clarity, one that transcended her personal pain and connected her to something greater. For the audience, her statement resonated deeply. It wasn't just about the Trump family, it was about every family, every relationship, every unspoken truth that lingered in the shadows. People nodded slowly, some whispering her words under their breath as though committing them to memory. Maryanne felt it too, the turning point not just for herself but for everyone listening. She realized that this moment wasn't just about confession, it was about transformation. As Maryanne continued, her thoughts expanded beyond her own story. "Secrets have a way of shaping us," she said softly, almost to herself. "They start small, a crack in the foundation, but over time they weaken everything we hold dear." She reflected on the cost of silence within families, how unresolved issues could ripple across generations like waves after a stone is thrown into still water. "We think keeping secrets protects us," she admitted, "but really they only isolate us further." Her voice softened as she turned inward, speaking more to herself than to the crowd. "Forgiveness isn't easy," she confessed. "It's not just about forgiving others. It's about forgiving ourselves, about letting go of the guilt and shame that keep us trapped." The metaphor struck a chord, a crack in the foundation. It was simple yet profound, an image everyone could understand. Relationships weren't built on perfection, they were built on honesty, on choosing to mend what was broken instead of hiding it away. Maryanne leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto the audience with newfound urgency. "What secrets are you holding on to?" she asked, her voice gentle but probing. "What bridges need mending?" Her question hung in the air, heavy with implication. For many, it felt personal, as though she were speaking directly to their own lives, their own struggles. Some shifted uncomfortably, while others nodded, tears welling up once more. "But here's the thing," she added, her tone lifting ever so slightly. "Confronting pain is hard. It's terrifying even, but it's also liberating. Sometimes, the hardest truths set us free and allow us to rebuild what truly matters." Her final thought lingered, echoing through the room long after she finished speaking. The audience sat quietly, absorbing her words, feeling both the weight of responsibility and the promise of hope. Maryanne reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she took Ethan's small fingers in hers. Together, they stepped away from the podium, a quiet yet profound act of connection that seemed to ripple through the room. For Maryanne, this moment felt like stepping into a new chapter. Just moments ago, she had been overwhelmed by guilt and regret. But now, holding Ethan's hand, she felt something else: hope. It wasn't perfect, and it certainly wasn't easy, but it was a start, a fragile thread of reconciliation woven between past and present. As they walked toward the wings, their footsteps echoed faintly, each step marking not just an exit, but a transition. This wasn't an ending, it was closure tinged with possibility. The weight of what had been revealed still lingered, but so did the promise of healing. Ethan glanced up at her, his piercing blue eyes filled with curiosity and trust. For the first time since he'd asked his pivotal question, there was peace in his expression. A quiet understanding that even broken things could be mended if given enough care. Behind them, the audience remained silent, their collective breath held as though unwilling to break the spell. No one clapped, not because they didn't want to, but because applause felt inadequate, almost disrespectful, in the face of what they'd just witnessed. Instead, murmurs rippled through the crowd, soft whispers exchanged between strangers who suddenly felt less alone. One reporter sat frozen, her pen hovering above her notebook, unable to find words for what she'd experienced. Another scribbled furiously, trying to capture the essence of the moment before it slipped away. Faint sounds filled the space, the rustle of papers being tucked away, the occasional sigh or sniffle. Some leaned forward, elbows resting on knees, lost in thought. Others exchanged glances, their expressions mirroring a shared realization. This wasn't just about Maryanne or her family, it was about all of them. It was as if the room itself exhaled, releasing years of unspoken truths and buried emotions. And in that release, there was clarity. A reminder that vulnerability, though painful, could also be transformative. Outside, rain began to fall, gentle at first, then steadier. Its rhythm tapped against windows and rooftops, washing away the dust of years past. To those inside, it felt symbolic, a cleansing of secrets long hidden, of wounds left untreated. The rain mirrored the emotional catharsis unfolding within the auditorium, a literal purification that paralleled the journey Maryanne and Ethan had begun. Forgiveness, renewal, redemption. These weren't abstract concepts anymore. They were tangible, alive in the air, carried by the droplets falling softly onto parched earth. For Maryanne, the sound of the rain brought a strange comfort. It reminded her of her mother's letters, of the plea to do better. Perhaps forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. It was about acknowledging the cracks and choosing to build something stronger atop them. As the last echoes of Maryanne and Ethan's footsteps faded, one final thought lingered in the minds of everyone present. Sometimes, the hardest truths are the ones that set us free. It was simple, concise, yet profoundly impactful. A distillation of everything they'd witnessed. The simplicity of the statement allowed it to resonate deeply, echoing the complexity of the journey they'd just shared. For Maryanne, it was a reminder of how far she'd come, and how much farther she still had to go. For the audience, it was an invitation to reflect on their own lives, their own secrets, their own relationships. And as the rain continued to fall outside, washing away the remnants of the past, the story ended not with closure, but with possibility. A quiet promise that even the hardest truths could lead to freedom, if only we had the courage to face